lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all?
Welcome back to this episode of Impolite Company. We're going to be jumping straight back into our conversation about gender. In this episode, we talk about issues within our own ranks, such as anti-trans lesbians and misogynistic gay men, the difference between queer spaces and gay spaces, with gay male spaces being historically exclusive to many groups. We also talk about zero-sum thinking as an explanation for the anti-trans sentiment and how edge cases are being used to weaponise against a whole community of people. It's a really, really interesting conversation. I really enjoyed having this conversation with Ella. Enjoy.
Worth saying that I think in the year 2023, the vast majority of the queer community is incredibly supportive of trans rights.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting and sad, you know, to think about the fact that a lot of the kind of key figures at the forefront of the anti-trans hate groups are lesbians. So like Kathleen Stock and people like that. And so I do think it does speak to this question of why do we also have this problem within our ranks? And that dates back for decades, right? I think I'd like to kind of play you. We're going to attempt playing a clip now.
Just quickly, I think also with gay men, I've definitely noticed, I think it's got better with time, like shutting lesbian women out of certain spaces and all that kind of stuff, and it not being, it's a world dominated by what gay men want or enjoy, or perceive to want or enjoy, the ideal. And a lot of the time, I remember going to a candy bar with friends years and years ago when I was like 17, 18, and feeling more comfortable, which is insane, right? Because I didn't feel like I liked the environments that were curated for gay men. I actually felt more comfortable in the candy bar with my friends there because it felt less predatory.
Well, that's an interesting thing. You know, I've got a gay friend who I was talking to the other day about going on a gay night out.
Yeah.
And he was saying, I really don't want to go to like Soho. I don't actually love being in very male dominated gay bars, and can we find something that's more, you know, in his wording was like, can we find a queer space rather than a gay space?
Wow.
And so that is kind of an interesting thing of like, I have kind of more and more gay friends who are almost not just personally identifying as queer, but seeking out spaces using the terminology of queer because it feels like it encompasses the kind of experience that they want to have. That isn't predatory, and they can go with their gay female friends and, you know, all of the above. But I'm gonna play a little clip just because I came across this years ago when I was just kind of looking into Stonewall and that kind of thing, and I think this is such a prime example of how heartbreakingly transphobic even the kind of fight for gay rights has been. And context on this clip is it's Sylvia Rivera was a prominent trans woman at the kind of forefront of Stonewall and gay liberation and that kind of thing. And there's this really famous speech that she's trying to give at a gay pride rally in 1973, where she's basically being booed off stage by gay people in the crowd. So I'm only going to play a short burst of it, basically.
I will not longer put up with this shit. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that.
What's your kind of reaction to that?
For me, it represents how long trans people and non-gender conforming people have been very clear on where they stand and how long they've been fighting the fight, and also how instrumental they've been to the fight of the broader LGBTQ plus community
Yes.
And the fact that they are not recognized and valued within that community is an absolute kick in the teeth and very sad. Makes me want to cry.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's like trans people have been at the forefront, to your point,
Yeah.
of the fight
Yeah.
from the beginning,
Yeah.
have been fighting for our rights.
Yeah.
And it feels, I sometimes try and identify why I feel so strongly about this, because I feel so much rage about this issue on a human level. And I think there's the injustice. It's partly the injustice of how dare we abandon the people who have fought for our rights at a time when they need our allyship and solidarity most. And I think on this kind of modern issue of transphobia, which is just really ramped up in what feels like the past 5 years or so, I think that gay people who are existing more accepted by heteronormative society are too quiet on this.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think that's it's the kind of feeling of turning the back being turned, right? And you just you stand in solidarity to propel everyone forward, and then at some point when the most palatable part of that, or the part that, like we were talking about earlier, the part that's assimilated the most and is easiest to comprehend for other people, for others, when they are propelled forward, they just don't look back.
Yes.
And they're quite happy to have stood on the shoulders of like giants and then just like be like, oh no, it was just us.
And it speaks to how interconnected the struggle is as well.
Yeah.
Of, you know, it when you were speaking there, it was just making me think of that fact, you know, that like the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action have been white women.
Yeah.
You know, people think of affirmative action as something controversial and as something that, like, you know, we're going to have quotas of black people in American universities and stuff. And the reality is that affirmative action practices have most benefited white women, you know, in the past however many decades. And so,
and that's really
it's white women's responsibility to speak to the benefits of affirmative action and to pull people up, you know, to not pull the ladder up as they benefit.
Yeah. And that's the thing. But I think the thing that happens is once people have gained, they're scared to lose. So even if they know by logic and that's presented in front of them, there's always this like inbuilt fear of loss. So it's like, well, actually, if I pull these people up, does that mean that there's less space for me?
Well, what do you think about that in the context of this current kind of really hostile, violent wave of transphobia in the past 5? Do you think that it's partly a product of that kind of zero-sum thinking? Like, I've managed to kind of cut myself a nice little piece of the privilege pie. I've got some power, I've got some status, I've got some whatever. And if more people have rights, my slice of the pie might get diminished. Or
I think as humans, it's a natural reaction to things. And maybe it's not a human thing. It's a society. It's the way our society's built. Everything is nothing's infinite, and everything is being depleted. You know, everyone needs to stand ground on their slice of the pie, and that's not the truth, right? Like,
no, I mean, I don't believe it's the truth. I don't believe that that's the right mindset. My view is one of abundance in a way, and by that I mean you having more rights doesn't impact my rights. In fact, you having more rights is good for me. It's a little bit like how striking workers gaining rights is good for all of us, whether we're a train driver or not, right? This is good. And so I don't believe that trans women having rights impacts my rights as a woman at all. In fact, trans women show us that there's more than one way to be a woman, and I think that benefits me. And trans women having access to domestic abuse shelters and gender affirming healthcare and the ability to just kind of like move through the world without harassment
basic human right.
doesn't negatively impact me in any way.
Yeah.
But I do think that some of the environment around this is a product of that kind of thinking, a product of the thinking that, you know, we've seen that trans people have gotten more and more representation over the past decade or so.
Yeah.
I kind of partly wonder if that representation brings with it exposure, and that exposure brings with it backlash. But, you know, I think it's just, you know, when you think about the fact that, you know, I think it was in 2020, there was something like 320 odd articles in the Times about trans issues, and all of them were negative, and none of them were written by trans people. There's a few things to say there, right? There's like, why so many articles? Like almost an article a day on a group of people that make up less than 1% of the population.
Yeah.
And no articles written by trans people. Like, imagine if all of the talk on women's issues and women's rights was by men in the Times, and they were writing an article a day almost, hostile to women's rights, all written by men. Like, it would be easy to see that that's sexist and misogynistic.
Exactly. and actually, that's not even a fair comparison. So for it to understand the impact, so let's say 50% of the population,
50%, yeah.
You know what I mean? So how much? So how do we even equate that to amount of articles? Like that would be essentially probably nearly all of the news cycle focused on negative articles written by men about women. Yeah.
And such a tiny minority.
Yeah.
A tiny minority that therefore doesn't really have a voice.
Yeah.
Partly because no one's inviting them to interview, and partly because they are such a small minority that they don't have very much representation. You know, we don't have any trans MPs, for instance. We don't have a huge amount of kind of mainstream representation of trans people. And when trans people are invited on things, you know, you think about Monroe Bergdorf, for instance, it's often like a kind of gotcha. It's a kind of trap to catch them out. It's a bad faith trap to catch people out. And so I guess I'm wondering your view on just this environment in general, and do you have a view on where you think it's sprung from?
I definitely think, I don't know exactly what was the fuel that started all of these polarized types of environments where things are talked about like disproportionately, but I think we can look back to Me Too movement, we can look back to Brexit, we can look back to Trump being elected, and all the fake news stuff. For me, that's when I think back, that's where I think the inflection point was of like these narratives where people were so polarized and had such strong opinions about specific things. I think what we're seeing is that's become our normal way of operating. So whenever you have a conversation with somebody, they either sit so far on one side or the other, and they're unwilling to have a conversation somewhere in the middle, or have not even meet in the middle, but be able to have a conversation in a way that's productive about speaking about their views, and almost celebrated or encouraged to be as far, stand your ground on certain things, right? You can't always be that, but it's interesting.
You have a responsibility not to be complicit.
Exactly. And I think the thing that I've realized is I'm no longer willing to have those. I'm no longer willing to be dragged into an unproductive conversation. What do I mean by that?
Interesting, difficult, and I go back and forth on this, not in relation to trans issues at all, but just as a general point around difficult topics, racism, homophobia, sexism.
Yeah.
That because there is no nuance anymore, there's a kind of like one-upmanship, there's a kind of binary conversation, there's a kind of, I'm going to say this thing online as a kind of mic drop moment. We're somehow not engaging in dialogue. But I also think it's worth saying that I don't think we should just be like endlessly engaging in dialogue with racists, for instance. There's that nuance to it as well, of like bad faith actors don't necessarily deserve
Exactly.
a huge amount of our nuanced understanding
Yeah.
in a way. And like both of those things are true. But I also think there's an interesting, it's really interesting that you spoke about Trump and the kind of inflection point of that moment in time and where we've gone from there, because I spend a lot of time on Twitter reading tweets.
Yeah.
Like I'm very much a passive bystander on Twitter.
Elon's tweets.
No, I've tried hiding Elon's tweets, but they just keep coming at me. And one of the interesting kind of anecdotal patterns that seems to happen is like the more online people get and the more they engage with certain types of kind of conspiracies, the more they engage with other types of conspiracies. So like if I'm an anti-vaxxer and I'm a Brexiter and I kind of start engage, the algorithms I think start showing me climate change tonight. It's like there's a kind of like wave of a conspiracy theory radicalization, if you want to call it that seems to happen.
And it follows, the thing that people I think find hard to identify is they all follow a similar formula of getting you to engage with that kind of content in terms of the way they construct the narratives around certain things. It's a formula.
And you have to fight it. You have to fight against it.
We talked about this the other day, didn't we?
We talked about the other day that when I try and research things around certain issues, I get shown like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, and I'm like, why is this coming up on my YouTube? It's trying to get me to engage with, but I know who those people are and I know what that content is. But if I didn't, it would be quite easy to get sucked in and then shown more of that stuff.
Or it starts as one thing and it descends into something very quickly. So like the first 15 seconds of the video would sound like something completely different to the second part. It kind of just switches and you're like, whoa, what am I watching?
Yeah. Oh, this seemed reasonable. And now.
Yeah, and now it's like, or a narrative change. There's someone like TikTok as an example. There's someone with like a blue screen background or green screen and they're reacting to something and it's their reaction, which is like the anti-trans reaction. But actually the video,
I see.
And you're like, whoa,
yeah.
What the hell? Like, how did that? What the fuck? Like, how did that happen? Why am I being shown this?
And I do think that's a part of the explanation for why you see a kind of descent.
Yeah.
What feels to me like a descent for perhaps otherwise reasonable seeming people.
Yeah.
Becoming almost obsessed with being anti-trans in their identity. It's become a little bit like being a Brexiteer. It's become an identity, firstly. And you also see this kind of what I think is a really scary framing of trans people as like trans rights activists or like TRA or like the trans lobby. You start to see this kind of anti-trans terminology becoming mainstreamed, and what that terminology does is to frame trans people who are just ordinary people trying to live their lives as some kind of cabal of people who've got some kind of agenda.
How many times have you heard the gay agenda or the
trans agenda? And that's linked to so many other types of bigotry, right? Like that's a kind of trope that gets used with anti-Semitic bigotry. It's this kind of positioning and weaponizing of ordinary people trying to live their lives as having an agenda, as some kind of aggressor, as some kind of scary demon for us to fight. And I think it's interesting that framework. Right, because again, that's a really like well-worn trope. Like you could speak to the head of the KKK and they would tell you they're not racist, right? Nobody's calling themselves a racist. Nobody's calling themselves a transphobe. Like J.K. Rowling is notoriously tells everybody that she's not a transphobe because nobody identifies with or very few people openly identify with a form of bigotry. But then they go and do all of the things that are quite obviously transphobic or racist or whatever. But a clever way of positioning your transphobia or your racism is, this isn't me being bigoted, this is, we're under attack. Rights are under attack. And so actually now I'm a kind of Joan of Arc figure. I'm a kind of crusader for women's rights and not a bigot.
And it's so true. And usually the facts around the reasons why you're doing it don't add up. So I remember I went to an exhibition and they were showing W.E.B. Du Bois. I think I said his name
Yes,
right.
yeah.
There was an exhibition. He did this big exhibition where he had like had a bunch of infographics about stats of African Americans at the time, and direct comparisons to the narratives in the press around like pauperism. I think is the one that comes to my top of my head. Pauperism within the African American community was very small, but the news that accompanied that at the same time was that African American people were violent, poor, opportunists, all these things. Deviant is like they weren't.
Yeah.
Like at the time,
well respected, well-to-do,
yeah,
making their own money.
Yeah, and it's just and so you can imagine, you know, certain types of white people at the time being riled up by all of this narrative.
Yes, but is that truth. Also that it's also that classic you can't win situation where it's like, on the one hand, we will demonize you for being all of these scary things that we've said you are, whether you are or not. But then also you get punished for not being those things. So there's a kind of narrative of, you know, when it comes to race, of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and stop being deviant and, you know, black on black crime and whatever. And then when black people do make a living, or, you know, against all odds are affluent, that's also, you know, the thing that springs to mind is the Tulsa massacre, which I think was in the 1920s, where you had this self-contained black community, affluent community, self-sufficient community in Tulsa that were well-to-do and high-earning and successful, basically. And the whole town was burnt to the ground and everybody was massacred. So can't win.
I can't remember if it's Tulsa as well, but the black bank that got essentially like looted as well. That had a lot of black wealth. And then now people are like, why do black people not trust authority or like banking systems? You're like, if you ask somebody, they might not be able to tell you why, but it's generational trauma of not trusting authority and not trusting institutions, because in the past, whether people realize it or not, and what things that have been passed down, people have been deeply fucked over.
It's even like, you know, with COVID, I remember a lot of people being like, well, why is there so much vaccine hesitancy in the black community? And it's like, well, have you ever heard of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment? You know, where a load of black men were given syphilis for a period of decades and not told, and like it was allowed to just progress in their bodies whilst they weren't given any treatment, just as an experiment. You know, why might black people be skeptical of medical institutions or banking institutions or institutions in general? You know, to your point, there's like a long history of not being able to trust those institutions and those institutions acting in. But to come back to I think that it's the kind of clever Trojan horse that gets used for so much bigotry is this kind of idea that we are defending our own rights, that our rights are in danger in some way. And sometimes when I think about how mainstream transphobia is in this country, I think about the fact that, you know, if you take any of the kind of red herring issues that get thrown out, you know, which actually, sorry, I shouldn't say red herring, because I think some of them are worthy of debate. Like there is a genuine discussion to be had about prisons and
it's the nuances that we should be having discussions about.
Absolutely. But I won't go too far down that rabbit hole, but you know, you get a single incident gets used to kind of tar a whole community, right? You get a single sex offender, because trans sex offenders exist, just like black sex offenders exist, just like you know, cisgender women sex offenders exist, and that gets used as a kind of, well, what about this one edge case of this situation? We should use that to demonize all trans people as potentially dangerous, potentially rapists, potentially gonna harm women in some way. And if you apply that to another community, it makes no sense. Like there's dozens of examples of cisgender women teachers sexually abusing
Yeah.
teenage boys.
Yeah.
Nobody is arguing that women shouldn't be teachers, right? Because we understand that you don't demonize all women
No.
based on the actions that isn't associated with their womanhood.
Yeah.
And the opposite seems to happen in this conversation.
And I think that really boils down to the fact that there is either ignorance or disbelief of that person truly identifying as who they are. And people cannot separate those things because they don't believe that that person
Is
is who
trans.
they say they are, or is trans, or is a woman.
Well, I
man.
think actually a lot of the kind of extremely transphobic voices online, from what I can gather, and by the way, I've read a lot of what they have to say. I've engaged and tried to understand a lot of what they have to say. I've read J.K. Rowling's essay, I've read all of this stuff. And it seems to me that it boils down to the fact that they don't fundamentally think that trans people exist.
Yeah.
And so the reason you can talk about trans women as trans-identified males or male-bodied individuals, right? These terminology that's a slur, basically, but is because you're defining them by their maleness, because their transness doesn't exist to you. It doesn't. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
It's not a real thing, and they are bad actors who are lying.
Yeah. And they're not to be trusted because we don't trust men. Cis.
No, I mean, that's an interesting. Yeah.
And that's like the logic behind it. There's not much in my
Thanks for listening, and join us next week for the next part of this episode.